I'm taking a chance because, I think what I've written and spoken, I've done a lot of interviews, I've been relatively honest, but not 100%. So I thought I'm going to be very honest and direct with you, too. So I hope that should add to the interview.
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs, we
still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Zero Squared is the Zero Books Podcast. This week's episode of the Zero Books Podcast features a conversation with Professor Pete Bowmer from Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington. Evergreen has been in the news lately as students protested Professor Brett Weinstein over an email he sent to a private faculty list. In the email, Weinstein objected to the students reversing what is traditionally called a day of absence, wherein people of color leave campus voluntarily to demonstrate their importance to campus life. This year, a call went out asking white people to leave. Brett Weinstein felt that this call abandoned a core principle of racial equality, namely that people should not be barred from participation in campus life based on the color of their skin. During the interview, Pete Bowmer tries to reframe this, suggesting that only a small group of white students were asked to leave campus in order to participate in seminars. About 200 students. However, it is my understanding, as of this recording, that all white students and faculty were asked to voluntarily leave, and that 200 students had the additional opportunity to participate in consciousness-raising seminars off campus. In any case, Weinstein has been called out as a racist for his email, and even as the students have damaged their reputation and the reputation of the college nationally, the protests have continued. Videos of the protests have gone viral online, and the college has become not only an embarrassment for the left, but a target for the alt-right. I want to thank Pete Bowmer for being a guest. At the end, we discuss the possibility of an open debate on racism and free speech being held at Evergreen. I surely hope this happens, and I would recommend people who would like to see this happen email President George Sumner Bridges of Evergreen to urge him to organize such an event. It's Wednesday, June 21st, 2017, and I'm Douglas Lane, the publisher of Zero Books and the host of this podcast. I want to thank Zero Books Club members and encourage people who enjoy this podcast to sign up to the Zero Books Club in order to receive a second podcast every week. Right now you're listening to St. Pepsi's Enjoy Yourself, which is a vaporwave hit. But in just a moment, you'll be listening to Pete Bowmer and I discuss the Evergreen Struggle Sessions. Peter Bowmer has been an activist in movements for radical social change since 1967. These have included anti-racist organizing. He has a PhD in economics from the University of Massachusetts, where he wrote a dissertation on the political economy of racism. On June 2nd, he published an open letter entitled In Solidarity with the Struggle for Racial Justice at the Evergreen State College. And we'll be discussing his letter and the situation at Evergreen in this week's episode of the Zero Books Podcast. So, Peter Bowmer, thank you very much, Professor, for taking the time to talk to me.
Okay, looking forward to it.
Yeah, so, listen, before we begin, what I want to do is sum up what I think of as a commonly accepted narrative about Evergreen for people who might not be following this, but who listen to my podcast, and then I'll give you a chance to correct me. Correct the narrative.
Okay, that sounds good.
Yeah. So in a nutshell, this is what's commonly known. Every year, Evergreen encourages or it holds what's known as a day of absence. It's not mandatory, but it's encouraged. The idea comes from a one-act play written by Douglas Turner Ward entitled Day of Absence. And in that play, all of the black people disappear from a small southern town, and the white people discover just how much they have come to rely on black people doing all sorts of unrecognized but vital work. It's sort of like a strike when they all disappear. At Evergreen, people of color have been leaving campus to demonstrate their value and their importance and their own contributions to campus life since the 70s. There's been a day of absence. This year, however, a group of students and possibly faculty decided to turn the practice on its head. Rather than have people of color leaving the campus, the activists asked for white people to leave. A professor named Brett Weinstein objected to this call. He objected to the request that white people leave, as he felt there was a big difference between what amounts to a one-day strike by oppressed people and maybe pushing people off campus based on the color of their skin. And, you wouldn't have to force people off campus, but whether it was through social pressure or by force, he felt that it was wrong. About a month after Weinstein wrote his email to faculty members in a private email list, somehow this email leaked, and students protested Weinstein. They felt his objection to the reversal of this day of absence was racist, and around 50 students interrupted his class in order to shout him down and call for his resignation. Since then, Weinstein has been warned not to go back to work on campus. At least once, the police told him that students were looking for him in a car-to-car search, and that they couldn't guarantee his safety. Apparently, the president had asked them not to go on campus or to stand down. Also, Brett has been making the rounds on right-wing and centrist talk shows and podcasts since the incident, and because of that, students have started to receive death threats. The college is receiving death threats. Faculty members are receiving death threats. I'm leaving out the viral video that depicts the quasi-kidnapping of the president of Evergreen, George Sumner Bridges, or what might be more charitably described as an assembly, wherein students did their best to demean the president in a style that, to me, was reminiscent of a Maoist struggle session. So there's my summary. Now, I'll let you correct it.
Okay, so let me add, I think there's quite a few either incomplete or maybe errors. So the first, with regards to day of absence, I've been at Evergreen teaching since 87, and I've been also involved, I've spoken often at these days of absence, day of presence. So the first edition is, they've always been, including this year, it's a day of absence, day of presence. And it's called DOA, DOP for those initials. Usually the day of absence has been the first day of the 2 days. They're usually 2 days apart, like Wednesday, Friday is very, very common. On the day of absence, it's usually been students, staff, and faculty of color go off campuses like a retreat, and they discuss issues around, racism, identity, Evergreen. And at the same time, on the day of absence on campus, there's discussions about, racial inequality, diversity, other forms of oppression, strategies, to deal with racism, strategies with other forms of inequality. And they've always been optional, okay? So it's, in other words, often, the classes go on always on both day of absence, day of presence. I've occasionally, brought my classes to the day of presence. And the day of absence, when I've had classes on that day I didn't have this year, I said students, they can go for sure. And it's almost encouraged, but they have to maybe make a report on that, write a paper for the class they miss. Okay, so that's the history. So it's a day of absence, the idea of people being, separate to discuss issues, but then to also come together on the day of presence. And usually at the end of the day of presence, there's some big event, like cultural, political event, like having, various spoken word films and so on. So this year, there's a committee that's set up that's basically staff, students, and faculty, and they suggested that on the day of absence, the white students and staff and faculty would have would be the ones to leave campus. But it was only seen as a very small number. They rented the Unitarian Church, which is about 2.5 miles from campus. And at that place, you had to sign up. Because I remember my class, I had to sign up because only 200 students could go, or 200 student, staff, and faculty out of 3,500. So it was no way seen as most people going. And in fact, some people couldn't even go because there wasn't either van space or classroom or room at the church for them. Okay, so it was totally a voluntary thing, and there was no coercion involved at all. And, social pressure is a very, very vague term to go, and it wasn't expected most people would go. So that's one incident. When some of these emails were coming out, I think they go back earlier to what you're saying. I'm not sure. I was in Greece working with Syrian refugees, which is a very big issue, the Syria issue for me, and I didn't get back till early March. And I remember talking to Brett Weinstein, whose office is next to mine. Even both of us don't use it that much. And another issue was, and this was also an issue of the students, there was an attempt, it began before George Bridges came. He's been a president very, very recently. I believe this is his second year as president. It was to make diversity and equity more of a larger part of the hiring, of student education, of staff and faculty. And the report, as far as I know, recommended that equity be thought of in the hiring process. It's kind of like an affirmative action idea, even though affirmative action is illegal directly in Washington, California, since a very right-wing or anti-affirmative action initiative got passed, I believe, in 98, but I could be off by the year. So anyway, Weinstein, at least when he talked to me about it, I think was more concerned about it would be giving more power to the top, to the president. He's worried about faculty losing power, which seemed like a valid worry. But then also he was worried that less qualified people would be hired, that it wouldn't just be their credentials, but, who's qualified is a very subjective thing. And to me, the idea of taking equity, diversity into account as one among many factors is a positive idea. Of course, any idea can be abused. So that was some of the issues. And then in terms of people going outside his classroom on May 23rd, there were other issues that had built up, and that's probably why it didn't happen immediately with the emails being released. There were a few issues on campus this year where there was discipline against students, and it seemed to me on at least two occasions the black students were they were the ones who were being put in front of disciplinary hearings, not white students who were also involved. One was kind of opposing a new campus police chief, and there was some kind of event for her, introducing her, and people disrupted a little bit. And then secondly, I think much more major, this happened sometime in May. I'm not sure there was a very closed Facebook group that was very anti-black in some of the comments, and people found out it, and they verbally challenged some of the students who were writing on it. And the two black students, or both first-year students, were basically called in by the campus police and said they had to go there, and nobody else on this list, or the white or non-black, because there was a native person too who was very involved in this, I think, group that was considered very anti-black. I didn't actually see the email, so I'm not sure exactly what was said there. So these are events that led up to the 23rd. And then the 23rd, okay, should I go on? The 23rd, okay, I was actually teaching in the building very nearby, but my class started at 10, and Weinstein's class, Brett Weinstein, began 9. So I just saw at the end people outside. From my understanding, and again, this comes from students who were there. I'm not saying this is the absolute truth. They said they went there. They didn't go into the classroom, but maybe they opened the door, and that at first they were challenging him, but in a respectful way. And then he was very, very disrespectful. He came out toward them, and then they got more disrespectful afterwards. But they thought it was because he was treating them in a really patronizing kind of way. And And I spoke to a few people who were there. There always was an exit for him at the time. So in terms of the incident, I don't know if you'd say it challenged free speech. I mean, that's a complicated question we can talk about, but it wasn't. I think the video doesn't show a full accounting of what happened that day.
Yeah. Well, listen, all I'll say about the video, is that if it's the case that he came out and was disrespectful to the crowd of 50 or so students, his behavior changed once the video started, because he was not disrespectful during that exchange when they were shouting at him. He was extremely patient. So,
yeah, I'm not sure. We both saw the video. I thought, disrespectful is not the right word. I still thought it was somewhat condescending.
Well, I mean, okay, but and I don't. Maybe you're right, but I think that when you feel that you're being shouted at and people aren't listening to you, being a little patronizing in response might be unavoidable. But that's really kind of to the side, because
I agree.
Yeah. The question here I have is, I guess it really centers on Brett to start with, because it sounds like everything you've said adds to my understanding, but it doesn't really alter my understanding fundamentally, because it seems like Brett's concerns were that he had not done anything to bring him into the line of fire around, say, police. We wouldn't say brutality, but police bias or disciplinary bias against people of color on Evergreen's campus. He was not involved with that, so it almost seems like they went to Brett because he might be a softer target. But his email was not. It may not be right. His position may be wrong, but it didn't seem to me to be explicitly inflammatory or racist. Would you agree with that?
Okay, so in terms of the students, and I wasn't involved in any of the planning. I did go, a lot of things you talked about, I was physically present, even though not the original thing at the class, but the various meetings to sit in, we can talk about that. I think there was a kind of a problem that should not mean somebody being fired, of course, of a view that race is not a biological construct. We all know that, right? It's one human race, and that's this mention about phenotype. But the social relevance of race in the current period of 2017, and even reinforced with the victory of Trump, which I think is very, very worrisome, I think has led to an area where the issue of challenging racism, white supremacy is so important, and that Brett Weinstein didn't really have a very limited understanding, to put it mildly, of racism. I'd say kind of clueless and kind of bought into the colorblind society, at least in a way that seemed very dominant in his views, maybe not totally in his views. And the action, like why going to him, in terms of the movement, it definitely had much more to do than him. But he's become somewhat the national focus. So whether it was right to go to him, but other things, there was some actions and activities around also. So he's become the main focus. I don't think originally it was seen certainly as him being the only focus. And I just want to add this, because maybe jumping ahead, the next day, there were like 12 demands put forward, and the demand was not to fire him. It was that he would be suspended for, it didn't say the amount of time without pay, but it was clear, and then have his job back. So demand, originally people did call for him being fired. By the time the demands became written in public, and it was only demand 11 out of 12 that he be suspended, but not be fired. So I think that's an important distinction.
Yeah, okay. In person, there were calls for him to resign.
That's correct. That's correct.
On the 23rd. But the formal list of demands only asked for him to be suspended.
Do you understand? History could pivot in this hallway right now. If we turn it. Listen to me. Yes, I know. History could pivot in the direction of the values that you are standing here for.
Yeah, resign.
What?
Resign.
I'm not resigning.
Okay.
If I owe an apology, I will deliver it.
Wait, hey.
Listen, here's what I want to say something about his color blindness. But I would say that on the left, there's a debate going on about how we conceive of structural racism and what the best approach to overcoming racism should be. And I tend to listen to people like Adolph Reed and take them seriously when it comes to the necessity to understand race, especially in the United States, through the lens of class. Not that class and race are even the same kinds of things. I don't think they are. But that you have to look at race, you can't take race as independently from the class structure of our society and understand it on its own. But the point I'm making is not really to defend Adolph Reed or that position, but just to say that I think that debating how to interpret the problem and overcome the problem of racism is vitally important. That there's a lot more dissent and disagreement on the left, not only between people of color and white people, but between people of color of all types, than maybe is understood, especially on college campuses. So to go after someone for having maybe a mid to late 20th century view of anti-racism where you aim at race blindness and equality and integration, to go after them as a racist and demand their resignation seems not only wrong-headed and maybe unjust, but also a real lost opportunity at a moment where we need to get ourselves sorted out and have internal debates.
Right. So that's a long discussion. We probably differ somewhat on it. And I think, to me, the question is how class and race and also gender, which we don't have to talk about right now, maybe it's not directly tied, how they interact. I think a purely analysis only around race being the central form of oppression is wrong. But I would say, in terms of structural racism, every issue that I can think of, whether it's climate change, economic inequality, housing, education, certainly the criminal injustice system, the idea of race or racism, because there's only one human race, I just put race in quotes, is central in that the challenging white supremacy in trying to build what I call principled unity, to build unity that's on the highest common denominator that really does challenge racism, but is aiming at unity among all oppressed people. And to me, certainly, working class people who are white are oppressed also. To me, the question is, how do you get there? And I don't think you get there by just saying what I call lowest common denominator politics. We're all oppressed by the 1%. I think we are, but in different ways. And I think the seeing how central still race is, and again, I mentioned the election of Trump, that obviously there are many, many reasons why, he has something like 30%, support in the country, really major support of a lot of people, that the issue of racism is still very, very central. So I don't know. So I see what you're saying.
Well, my main point wasn't necessarily, as I said, to defend Adolph Reed, or that class analysis informing race analysis, but it was more to say that, listen, there's more than one perspective, even on the far left. And that in order to come to an understanding, a true understanding, these ideas have to be debated, and to try to shut someone down or demand his resignation for having the wrong kind of view in service of anti-racism. It was not as though he had a racist view. Look, there are racists, real racists ideological racists in the world, and they're organizing. But so what we're debating and what he was debating was how to be an anti-racist. And for doing that, by wanting to problematize anti-racism and have a different view on it, he was shut down and asked to resign.
Yeah. Well, yeah, as I said again, it wasn't a demand, but I mean, you're not fully wrong. To me, yeah, it was more than I was against. I had some sympathy for him, even though I would use the word clueless about racism opposed to anti-racist in terms of his view. But that isn't a reason to be fired for sure, or even to be disciplined necessarily. But when he went on Fox News that Friday, and then his subsequent The Wall Street Journal article, his second interview, some of the other interviews he's done, I'm not saying he should be fired. I don't support that now, but I did lose all sympathy for him. I had sympathy before, some sympathy for him, but I really lost that after that, when a lot of the narratives that really fit into a kind of a very racist country, a very right-wing country, a Fox News view of the world, he went along with it. And by being on the Tucker Carlson show, it gave that view far more credibility. Probably Fox News might have done a big expose anyway by him going on, a so-called progressive person. That, to me, added to this very sensationalist right-wing view, and maybe there's some tactical mistakes are being made. I certainly think that's true, but it just became this thing of the mob, black people running Evergreen, black supremacy, all that are just so far away from the truth, but fit into this view that's very convenient to those who basically want to use racism to scapegoat, people of color. So I found what he did afterwards, to me, really unacceptable.
I would agree with you. So to this extent, I myself, in a similar situation, would not go on Tucker Carlson with this story. There have been I would go on Tucker Carlson, but I wouldn't go on to support his segment. You know what I'm saying? Like, I would be interviewed adversarially. But here's the other thing. But let me ask you this, though.
No,
what did
I agree. I don't think going on. Let me just. I don't think going on. I think what you said makes a lot of sense. I think to go on, it's a complicated question, but I think definitely you could defend going on, but to challenge that narrative. So to me, it's going on is questionable, but it's more how you performed on those shows.
So here's my question, though: What is it in Tucker Carlson's narrative? Because he has this segment which he calls Campus Crazies or Campus Loonies or whatever. And he makes an argument, kind of the same argument every week, I think, or every time he does it. I don't know how often he does it. I don't really watch, except on YouTube.
Right.
But
same.
But what I want to get to is, what is it that Tucker Carlson is saying, and that Brett Weinstein agreed with, that you think is a right-wing racist perspective?
Okay, so first, not to repeat too much, is this idea that whites were forced off campus. I mean, that is totally false. Carlson said that, and Brett, I don't remember exactly the details, but he certainly didn't challenge that in any kind of way. So that's one very key part. And then, and we can talk about the whole idea of the Chinese Cultural Revolution, which you raised, but to me, it wasn't the mob. Classes went on. Again, in my class, I'm not saying it was common. There was real dialogue about some of the issues. And students who were critical of what had happened did speak up. Maybe they were challenged, but they did speak up. And so the idea of a mob running campus is just not correct. And he again accepted the idea of a black mob. And then I don't know if the black supremacy, I thought it was there. It may have been in the Wall Street Journal article, but I know that term also. And we live in a country where you look at all the positions of power, they're still disproportionately run by whites. educational system.
Oh, yeah.
Like, look at yeah. So I just think the black supremacy fits into, I said this cold-blooded view that black people organizing is somehow reverse racism, or the idea of the fear of black people. I think even a lot of the shooting of African Americans by the police is very much tied to fear. I think so much playing this fear of black people.
Yeah, there's a lot of I think there's been scientific research done on kind of attitudinal studies done amongst police. And what's interesting is even amongst black cops, there's a large fear of black people. And it's and so, no, look, I definitely see that. I definitely see that the narrative of an angry black mob pushing white people off campus is inaccurate. I mean, if you look at the footage, that's a mischaracterization. But there was another part of what I think what Tucker would say if you confronted him with that is he would say, no. What I'm saying is that liberal universities aren't respecting foundational American values around free speech, and they're indoctrinating our students, blah, 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 blah. So my fear is that it's because we have lost the plot on being able to have disagreements and having a very hardcore kind of absolutist free speech position that is given the right, the ability to concoct these narratives around the angry black mob, that and make hay out of it. I mean, one thing that happens, like for instance, if you go to YouTube and you type in Evergreen State College, you'll find first what you'll find is the Tucker Carlson interview, maybe the Joe Rogan podcast, but then you'll find a myriad of far right YouTubers who go directly to that second narrative, to that narrative about how basically the blacks are out of control, they need to be put down, all that. And I think it would be easy for people who I can see how this incident could lead a lot of people to becoming more racist. But I wouldn't put the blame squarely on Brett Weinstein. I would say that he certainly maybe shares some responsibility for it, but also the way we're handling our disagreements and ourselves is partially responsible for tactically giving the right these weapons. What do you think? Am I being too hard on people of color?
Even the thing I wrote pretty quickly afterwards, and I looked at it again when I knew you looked up my article too. I do believe that on college campus, including Evergreen, this idea of safety is overdone, right? If you have a different view, like around issues often of sexual identity, the issue of trans rights, a very big thing at Evergreen, around race, around gender, sexual orientation, it's seen as not safe. And I think the word safe is almost overused when it just means people feel like that their views are criticized. So I do believe the word safety often means like not hearing different views. I do take the idea of academic freedom and free speech seriously. I'm not an absolutist that way. And I also think some of the context in what you're referring to is this kind of growing economic inequality, the continued kind of racism inequality that's invisible to some but so visible to other people, both white people and, a lot of people of color. And a lot of the context is wanting to really challenge injustice. And any movement, when it struggles, people are going to make mistakes. I do think, in thinking about it, like the whole thing with going to the class that way, there are tactical errors being made. And, like you were saying, could be very easily used. And we do have to think about how that's going, how what we do is going to be portrayed. We don't control it, but you can't just ignore that. I guess ethically, I don't feel what people did was really wrong. I do think tactically there were issues, but it seems to me that Weinstein does have, and I'm not disagreeing with you, more responsibility how that was going to be used by the right wing. He's definitely not a right winger, I'm not saying that in any way, but to me it's so predictable what you were saying, how these various white supremacist groups, have made him into this kind of hero, which he hasn't, again, as far as I know. I've tried to invite him a few times to have dialogue with him. He said he wants a dialogue with him before, but I'm sure he's not interested now. That really challenge that, saying, how abhorrent that is. As far as I know, he hasn't done that.
Well, I think he's gone on his Twitter and said, hey, do not make death threats in my name, that kind of thing.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah, but I don't know if he said anything more. And, I know one other professor who was didn't get anywhere near the kind of confrontational protest that Weinstein did, but who felt that he had been attacked over trans issues unfairly. This is someone who was on the left and who, after being kind of mobbed, not only, he officially left the left. He made a public announcement. He was no longer part of the left. He went on right-wing talk shows, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that particular professor is fully responsible for the decisions he makes, and that his actions are to be condemned. There's for a variety of reasons. I don't think they were particularly honest ultimately either. I think Weinstein's doing better, but it's really hard when you are at the center of a mobbing like this, and I think that's a fair thing to call it. And you feel that you're an ally, that you feel like your politics are, in alignment really with the people who are angry with you. I mean, actually, that hurts worse than being attacked by the right. A lot.
No, for sure. No, I agree. But, the thing with the mobbing threats, any kind of threats to them, I'm totally opposed to. Mm-hmm. And
mobbing isn't necessarily always a threat. The mobbing happens online too, right?
Yeah. Okay, I know the whole doxing thing, but for example, the 23rd, Tuesday, that's when people were outside his classroom, right, and challenging him really strongly. But then there was a meeting originally because I remember my class ended up going to maybe 11:30, where students played a very big voice. Bridges was there, and then a meeting was set to 4 o'clock in the afternoon. That's maybe, I know there's been a lot of videos of that meeting too, the 4 o'clock one, and there are probably 500 plus people there. Evergreen's a small school. It was really huge, just by word of mouth, basically, and maybe 80 or more black students, which to me was so impressive in a pretty white campus. Maybe one of the largest numbers of black students I've seen together outside of maybe graduation. So it was very, very impressive. And Weinstein, I think I talked to him, before it, and he went to that meeting. And if there was really such a fear of his safety, or he was so afraid, he probably wouldn't have gone. But he did go to it. Nobody threatened him physically. There were some strong words said, and it was basically students of color who led the meeting, basically took over it in terms of the comments. And again, it was very, very strong. But to me, it was also people developing their strengths and abilities. And, every movement I've been involved, like you said at the introduction, a long time, people make mistakes whenever you're developing. But to me, it was also a lot of really articulate comments, mentioning, for example, there's that Evergreen, which I think is less racist than most schools, by the way. I should probably say that more clearly than I have when I've talked, but there are real issues here. So even the mob thing, I do think is somewhat overstated, even though, probably he was treated worse than, he should be. He's definitely not a white supremacist in any kind of way. The
next day, I guess, is when he felt he wasn't on campus, but the police warned him not to go. The day after. Do you happen to know whether or not there really were students going car to car looking for him?
Okay, I definitely don't know that, and I haven't heard it. I'm not saying it's false, but again, this fear thing, there was that meeting that I was there, inside Bridges' office. I was really packed with students and faculty, And I remember the campus police calling Bridges, I believe 3 different times. That's what he said, if he was safe. And I mean, it was 100%, there was he was under no fear. And again, I'm saying this fear thing really sometimes being overdone. And
I think that, I can see that it might be overdone, but if I was in a position where the police said, don't go to campus, we can't guarantee your safety, I'd take that to heart. I don't know. I mean, and I don't think Weinstein's lying about what the police said to him, right? I mean,
I don't. I wasn't saying that. Yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah. So, but the point is, let's move off Brett for now, and let's talk about that meeting, because what I've seen of that 4:00 meeting, I guess, with 500 people, and 80 black students, what I've seen doesn't look good. But there is an unedited hour-long video of that meeting available, and I have not been diligent enough to sit through that. What I've seen are highlights edited by right-wingers, really. But those highlights, look, if I was a professor, I would not say that those kids needed to be formally disciplined for their behavior, but I would stand up and say, hey, we're all on the same side. Let's not try to belittle each other. Let's not run each other down. And, you can't tell the president of the college not to use his hands when he talks or tell him to fuck off. Obviously there are limits to demanding politeness, and there are times when you're not going to be polite. But I felt that there was this sort of animosity building up, not just amongst the black students, but just amongst the students towards anyone who was white in a position of authority. Okay,
so I was there because I actually had a meeting that kind of put me at 5. But I was half an hour late, so I was there from 4 to 5:15, 5:20. And I remember Bridges originally said he had an hour, so I thought it was okay. But the meeting continued after I left, and I haven't seen any video. So I would say there was really, really strong distrust of people, like you're saying, in authority, particularly white people. But then I do think on the side that people, to by their practice, not by their words, because words are so easy, particularly at universities, to say we're all in it together is not enough. And I know I was kind of, I put my hand up, and I'm pretty well known by the students. I've been so active on campus and in the community. I still am, and I was surprised. I had my hand up for a while. I wasn't called on because definitely students of color were privileged, right, to speak. But then the next day, I saw one of the people who was like maybe the main kind of person calling on people, and they came up to me and said, they were looking for me. I was the next person they were going to call on. So again, I was thought, maybe I'm not being called on, but they said they definitely had intended to. I mean, I think they were being very direct. And again, so, some of it is just like suspicions, but there were this case of, particularly the white faculty, staff, administration was saying, we don't trust you. But to me, that's pretty much part of the history of activism in the United States, that for very many good reasons, African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans particularly don't trust white people, even they say the right thing. And if people can show in practice that they really are challenging racism, I think that's, that goes back to the early discussions. That creates a basis of what I call principled unity as opposed to just lowest common denominator politics. So a lot of that was going on, and maybe in ways that neither you or I would see as ideal, but to me, it's more understandable. It doesn't make me condemn the movement or anything like that.
Well, you're talking about what's called a progressive stack, right? And that was common, on at Occupy. I have my own criticisms of it, but I certainly wouldn't condemn anyone for using it, right?
And that's exactly what's going on.
Right. So that
maybe in a really well, let me just say one more thing. So I think it was even one that I think a really big part of this movement, and it's maybe a little bit bending the stick the other way more than is necessary, but altogether it's very positive. It's really kind of centering the voices of the oppressed, people of color, black people, trans people. And I wish the issue of class was more considered. I think that's a very fair critique, but centering voices who often, even on the left, are often marginalized, other people speaking for them. So that's been a really major part of this, which to me is altogether very positive.
Well, here, I'm going to push back on that a little bit, because if you talk to someone who's a white nationalist, you know what they'll call themselves? They'll call themselves oppressed. And that's what justifies their behavior to them. And I think that any individual person, who happens to be a person of color or not, needs to not stand on their oppression as giving their ideas validity. Their ideas stand apart from their experience of oppression. The experience of oppression is what moves people to be critical, but the ideas stand apart from that. So, I don't think that it's a good idea to feel that you have more insight based on your oppression. I do think it's a good idea to make sure that people who are experiencing oppression or experiencing, the battle on the ground are heard from. That they need to be able to. That's the reason for the progressive stack. But I don't think that there's any reason to think that people of color have special insight at all, and not that certainly that they white people don't either, right? So, so I'm sort of I'm very skeptical of this notion that oppression, the people who are oppressed have a special insight, and that I would include working people in that, and that makes me very unpopular amongst some Marxists. But anyway, so you push back on me. I'm ready.
Okay, well, so that was a lot of interesting points. So, a lot of the communiques and the demands, they were signed, because people didn't want to put their names on it, they were signed those who are often not heard. And I kind of liked that. That was the name that people used in the demands, the press releases, the communiques, and so on, those who are often not heard. And it's, again, we've kind of skirted around the issue, which I'm really happy to not discuss, but unless you want to, is the whole issue of identity politics. And that's the heart of a lot of what's going on, right? And my position is it's slightly different from yours, that identity does matter directly, being on, let's say, the side of the ones who most directly feel the oppression, whatever the axis is, that it does give people some, maybe that their voice is so important to be heard and should be listened to very carefully. I think that, obviously, to me, identity in this way is not destiny, right? That you have such different views, it doesn't make it right. And let's say around race, that people who are white, like myself, that we have a major role to play in challenging racism. We can understand, not in the same way, but we can understand white supremacy. And I would argue racism also, is bad for white people. That's a whole other discussion, but that in different ways. So my position would be, I'd say, in between yours and the one where I think to a lot of the a lot of what's going on, let's say, at Evergreen, many other campus, is identity in a way that I'm not fully in agreement with, even though I do think that identity, and particularly marginalized voices and groups, it's so unbelievably important. It's just that at least in many places.
Let's agree on this in a way, because like at Grenfell Tower, okay, in the UK, in London, there were a poor, oppressed people, often of color, who have been trying to be heard for, I guess, over a year, right, about the conditions there. Now, they had a special insight into the conditions there based on living there, They might not be the ones who would tell you how to rewire the electricity. They may not know exactly how to do that, right? But they knew that the conditions were intolerable and that it was at risk for fire even, right? And they were ignored. So, obviously, getting people who are living under oppression, of making sure they are heard from, and that not only are they heard from, but that their needs are met, and that we have a society that doesn't allow them to burn to death. Obviously that's really vitally important. But there's that notion, and then there's the notion that because of your, whether or not you're living in Grenfell Tower, because of your race and the history of racism, you have the right to not only be heard, but to dictate the terms of the conversation and to shut down voices who are disagreeing. And I think that goes way too far. It not only doesn't serve discourse or free expression, it doesn't serve the aim of making society better either. So that's my position there. And just to say one more thing about the meeting, I feel that in that meeting, a lot of what was going on. Now, I didn't hear anything of substance, and I want to get to what was the substance of it. But some of what was going on was a kind of moment of delight where, and look, you don't have to be black or oppressed in any special way. Anytime a student gets to make their professors and especially the president of a university look like an idiot, there's going to be some delight in that. And I remember being a student, and I often didn't really like, especially the people who weren't my direct, instructors, but above them, like the principal or president. So I can understand the desire to show this guy who's really boss. But I think it was really counterproductive in that meeting, especially as it was released online.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I think that partly of people becoming, social change agents is not just respecting or being kind of accepting the power of people because they have some authority. If they deserve it, it shouldn't be just mindlessly challenging them, but that we can challenge people who have power, and they're using that power in a way to maintain, to me, a very, unjust, exploitative capitalist system. That's an important lesson to be learned. And to me, again, you develop things, but that's, very, very important. That just because somebody's a president, a board of trustees, a professor, doesn't mean that they can't be challenged. Now, maybe some of the ways they were being challenged were over the top, but the idea of challenging that, to me, is far more positive than just being obsequious. This person's a president, they're a business manager, that a congressperson, etc.
I'm not saying that you have to respect them as president. I'm just saying that, telling him to not use his hands when he talked, or escorting him to the bathroom, or telling him that you didn't care what he said, all of that kind of thing. And I have very little sympathy for him, actually. Yeah. But I just feel that was symptomatic of me of being unserious about actually doing it.
Well, there's some, it's not, that wasn't most, I didn't see the hand thing. I've seen reference to the hand. I was there. It may have been after I left. I mean, once, he said something that was opposite of what he meant, that was really racist, a white supremacist. And people really started laughing at him. But then, he said he'd used the opposite of the word he meant, and I totally accepted it. And I thought the response was maybe a little bit strong. But, and again, it was just, I think, a question of saying where, you have power, white professionals, the professional managerial class has a lot of power in society. And even though it's not all white, we know, but it's challenging that and trying to say that we're making a different set of, who's going to be in leadership on this issue. I mean, that's, I think, what was going on a lot.
Yeah. Okay. So what are the demands? Can we go through?
Okay. So I don't have all of them in front of me. There were 12 demands, and I think some of them,
are they online?
One demand.
Can we look online? Or
I couldn't find it online. I did look at it. There are somewhere. I received copies of them. I do have an email somewhere. I can tell you most of them. Okay. The 12th demand was he met the demands, so there were really 11 demands, okay? The 11th one is about Weinstein being, like I said, disciplined or suspended. One of the demands, which I thought was really good, and I wish more had really dealt with issues of class and resources, was that Evergreen should provide financial aid and an advisor for undocumented immigrants. because most of the programs, there's students who are undocumented immigrants cannot get a lot of the loans, Pell Grants, etc. So that was another demand. There were demands about setting up a center and hiring someone to deal with basically, I think it was trans, but it may have been, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, but there was definitely around hiring people, having a center around that, like a small space that people go to. That was another demand. A lot of demands dealt with sensitivity training and education around racial sensitivity, racism to students, staff, and faculty, and making those required, and also for faculty being hired, that be a condition of them coming and they would agree to go through some such program. There was another demand about the police, the Evergreen police, not expanding the number of police, but also that they be disarmed. The police here used to be called security, and they didn't have weapons. But then, even though students and faculty voted overwhelmingly against the police being armed, they were armed in very limited circumstances. Now it's 24/7, and I and many other people worry that it's going to lead to some people being shot on campus, and also it creates more of a division between the police and students and faculty. And again, with the racial aspect, I think particularly worrisome for like black and other students of color. So that was another demand. Those were a lot of the major demands. Oh, there were two other people. Sorry, there were two other people. So Weinstein, it wasn't a demand to be fired, I've said that, but there were two other people, one who works in student affairs, who was involved in some of the swing thing I was telling you about, and a police officer named Odell, who, when the thing happened in class, he sort of pushed his way through to protect Weinstein and pushed, again, I wasn't there, so I didn't see it. Particularly black students that pushed him away to get toward Weinstein. So there was, and then he also said that he didn't think there was any racism in Evergreen, which I don't think is a reason to be fired for. But there was demand he be fired also.
Okay. So, so those are the demands. Now let's talk about the background a bit. So one of Weinstein's big objections here, when it comes to bringing equity to Evergreen, because I guess there's an equity council, is that there's a contradiction or a conflict between the way Evergreen is structured as an educational institution and the demands for equity. And this is something I heard about on the Joe Rogan podcast. Maybe you can explain it to me a little more. But my understanding is that Evergreen College is unique, that it's maybe on something like a block plan, where you have intense study on one subject for a term or maybe a year even, and there aren't any grades, and that it requires that students participate full time. And that what people are saying, who are more concerned about equity, is that this should be changed in order to allow non-traditional students to be part of the education process, to be students. That people who are disadvantaged in some way, whether it's by color or class, may not be able to afford to take the time to participate in the block plan, and would be better served by a more traditional unit-by-unit approach to education. Am I mischaracterizing?
Okay. Well, let me tell you a quick. Evergreen opened in 1971, and I think it's a really exciting place. I mean, partly why I'm happy because basically, most of my life's been devoted to like economic, social change, liberation, transformation of society, and so many of the students here, I think more than most campuses, not the majority, are really interested in making the world a better place. They're not just going to school to get a degree because their parents told them. So the largest part of Evergreen is it's called coordinated studies. You teach with other faculty. It's often very interdisciplinary. In fact, it's encouraged. So a student takes a class for like 16 credits a quarter, which is full-time. You just take one program, and it meets close to 16 hours a week. So, for example, the class I've taught the most commonly here is called Political Economy and Social Movements, Race, Class, and Gender. and we combine history, economics, politics, basically, a few other sociology, and usually you teach with 2 other faculty, so it'll be like 75 students, and 25 students are in the seminar. Seminars are a really big thing here, and then maybe half the time you meet with lectures, presentations, workshops, all 75 together. And at the end of the quarter, which students write evaluation of faculty, faculty write of students. So it's basically the system. So it does prejudice the system, or at least toward a full-time study. But you have a lot of older students, too, and a lot of first-generation college students, particularly the ones in-state. The out-of-state, because it's cheaper than private schools, you have a lot of out-of-state students coming, even though officially it's only 25% who are usually pretty well off. But certainly for the last 10 years, and maybe longer, they've changed the name. It's called Evening Weekend Studies. There are also 8-credit classes, usually either all day Saturday or on weekends, and even 4-credit programs like language classes. So in addition to the 16-credit, you have a lot of these Evening Weekend Studies programs that tend to be older students, working students, even though most of the 16-credit students also are working, that can accommodate people for these shorter time periods. So I don't really see how this Equity Council does really interfere with that. Maybe one thing, there's a recommendation that Bridges kind of supported it. So right now, a full-time program is 16 units, which is a lot. There have been suggestions that a lot of programs would have to have a 12-credit option, so the students either could take it for a little bit less or maybe take a class like a Spanish class or statistics in addition to that.
Okay, so that's not a major concern. The major concern is about shifting power away from Weinstein I'm talking about here, for shifting power away from the faculty to the administrators. And using equity as the reason to do so, and then hiring practices and otherwise. What would the other things be that equity, an attempt at equity, how could that end up empowering the administration over faculty?
Okay, so I think that, and I said that earlier, that is a fear of his, and I do think that a lot of stuff has come from the administration for reasons, I'm not sure. So to be honest and fair to him, which I'm trying to be in this interview, that was a fear. He did express that to me. And I do think there are other faculty who were worried about that. But it seems to me that the issue, of equity is a really important issue himself. And to me, Weinstein really downplayed the importance of equity and diversity in just being worried about the one part that he's worried about, to me, justifiably, so that maybe the administration would take more of a role in hiring people than they do now. Faculty really have a lot of power at Evergreen right now in terms of teaching these programs. You pretty much decide what you want to teach, with other faculty. The hiring, even though officially it goes through the provost and the president, in very, very rare circumstances, are faculty to be hired who the faculty, and maybe there's some students on the committee, even though not that many, usually who they recommend to be hired does get hired.
Well, let's talk about systemic racism a little bit.
Okay.
What does systemic racism mean to you?
Okay, so let me talk about generally and then about Evergreen specifically. Is that good?
Yeah, in general first, because I just kind of want to know, like, how does systemic racism, what is the system or structures? This is a question I had written down when I sent to you. I don't think I've stuck by these questions very well, but what structures are in place that enforce and guide systemic racism in society?
Okay, so going back, to probably the 60s, we've moved from a system where I would say kind of overt racism to one of, I call it formal equality, you can call it colorblind, but to me, substantial racial inequality. And when I think of systemic, to me, most of the institutions, the criminal justice system, which I do a lot of work, like political economy and prisons. Like yesterday, I felt really honored. I was a guest speaker for a Juneteenth event at a prison near here for a group called Black Prisoners Caucus, and they invited me to speak. I was the only speaker from outside the prison, certainly the only white person there. And if you look at how disproportionate who's in prison, that to me is one example of systemic systemic racism. You know, the very good book by
that's great.
Michelle.
But what is the system or structures that create that condition? Is it in the institution of police, or is it in the courts? Is it?
It's all okay. So, do you know the book "The New Jim Crow" by Michelle Alexander?
Yeah.
So she argues. So to me, the system still is 21st century U.S. capitalism. That's the system. I'm using the word "system" is a very vague word, but in every aspect, from who's arrested, who's charged, how much time people get, who gets probation. You know, the length of the sentences, how you get treated when you get, let's say, out of prison, that systemically, again, it's race and class. I want to make it clear it's not just race, but race is a part of it. You know, there are a lot of poor white people in prison also, and I try to reach out to them too, but pretty unsuccessfully so far. So that, to me, is one example of systemic racism, the whole criminal justice system.
One thing that is interesting about, see, when I look at for the structures that reinforce racism in society, what I found, and I'm not an expert, is that it has to do quite a lot with economics. That what you have is neighborhoods, black neighborhoods, which are underfunded, and that sounds like it means that they're not getting enough state support. But there's not a lot of inherited wealth in those neighborhoods, so you have people who have very little familial support, and there also is less resources dedicated to their neighborhoods through the state or the city as well. They have less wealth in terms of businesses in their neighborhoods. That you have poor neighborhoods, and they're poor for historical reasons because of racism to a large degree. But the trouble there is, okay, so then you have what comes from that is you have increases in crime because of that, and then you also have increases in police interaction, and attitudes develop or are reinforced. That are old attitudes, really, that end up targeting people of color. So you've got this multifaceted problem. But if you try to address the problem, say, by training police officers, the wealth inequality is going to remain. And so you're not actually going to address the core problems. You're not going to get enough resources in. I mean, like an infrastructure program to rebuild these communities and invest in these communities might go a lot farther than sensitivity training would to address these problems.
I agree. So I think in terms of the demands going back, I think there was more focus than I would certainly make on the sensitivity. And again, you can't look at one institution in isolation, like the criminal justice system. Yeah, in isolation, the larger political economy is a limited analysis. But again, I think how housing is organized too, is access to loans. Even if you look at the 2007, 2009, financial meltdown. I mean, there were so many of the banks, like Wells Fargo being the most publicized, who gave, for example, African Americans who even qualified for non-prime mortgages. They were given prime mortgages. That's been very much documented. So again, and then housing historically, blacks had far less access to get mortgages. The whole, going back to certainly before the 40s, but certainly, with the post-World War II, and that gets reproduced. But to me, that's both race and class, playing itself out. So it's housing, I think just jobs, networking, who people know for getting jobs being such an important part of it. And so I think that tends to reproduce, inequality of the job market. Even, from stuff I've looked at, figures, if you look at, for example, for educational level, at every educational level, both African Americans and Latinos, even though a little bit lesser extent, they earn less than whites. They have higher unemployment rates than whites for the same levels of education, even though, again, the educational system, partly because of the funding, which you indirectly mentioned, like the whole use of property tax mortgages, there's really a kind of a systematic difference in terms of, resources being spent for education by race and class. And again, class being so important in that too.
So like when it comes to policing, for instance, the weird thing is that impoverished black neighborhoods have two problems. They have the problem of violence from the police targeting usually young black men, and they also have the problem of under-policing, which seems contradictory, but it's actually also a fact yeah. So the I guess what I'm getting at here is that I feel that many of the students, and it's understandable, they're 20 years old, aren't looking at the issue in its depth just as much as, I've even stated it briefly. And because of that, they're aiming their ire, and more importantly than aiming their ire, they're aiming their fixes at institutions that will never be able to actually correct the problems. Like Evergreen, no matter what you do in an unequal society, Evergreen will never be able to be a perfectly equitable institution.
So you're definitely right on that, but maybe Evergreen could do more. Like, I'll just give you one example to me, which is pretty striking. I had some argument with somebody on Facebook about that. So Evergreen, for many years, there's no faculty, because faculty do have specialties, not one faculty whose focus is African studies. And there are almost no classes where Africa plays a large role in the curriculum here. I know I've often sponsored individual students who do work in Africa, because you can do independent study with faculty besides the programs I mentioned to you. But to me, a school of over 4,000 students, that there's nothing about Africa in the curriculum. Now, you can't do everything. That seems to me...
Is there Black history there? I mean, do you have a Black history program?
There are some people, again, it's way... there is some Black history with the U.S., and I think that's good. I mean, there should be more on it. It's not... I think it's underrepresented, but at least there's some attempt that way. So, again, I do think Evergreen is not worse than most schools, but I think it's better than most schools, but I think that to me is a really, really major, shortcoming. I mean, that's just one, to me, very, very concrete example.
Well, what would happen if you did increase? I mean, I'm not saying that. Look, obviously, studying African history is a useful and a good thing to do. Just knowing history is a good thing to do. And I know myself, I know nothing about African history really. I would do well to study it. But what would the consequences be for Black students in having more options to study African history, and especially if in terms of going on from Evergreen and finding work as a history major in African history? Would there be more opportunities for Black students if that was? I mean, am I being too pragmatic here, or what?
Yeah, I think you're being too pragmatic. Again, this is a lot from work I've done in the community, in prisons and other things. I think the idea of identity, of feeling like other people have this background, and African Americans know that there's no history of feeling connected to struggles in Africa. That's the origin, knowing very little about it, and really want to learn about it, just in terms of feelings of self-worth. I know sometimes those terms are overused, but to me seems just like really, really important. Not just Black studies. I think the whole thing with like we just hired somebody finally around Latino studies. The history of the Americas, I think in terms of people's background is really important. And somebody criticized me online saying, that, we don't have Italian studies. But I guess given the history of racism, it's somewhat different to me, slavery. But also, like I wrote back, partly, just to challenge the person. Africa's a continent, not a country, because this woman said, I'm Italian, there's no Italian studies at Evergreen. But, Africa is, a continent, so many countries, and just the ignorance, of it, Africa, I think it's to me, it's really important for Black students, but if I meant only for Black students, I think also for white students, Latino students, Asian students, for all students, learning more about Africa, I think is really important.
Yeah, okay. I think you're right, but I think you're largely right. But I think what happens is here's how the argument sounds anyway, and maybe this is how it's made. So that you say, look, Black people in America have suffered under racism for generations, and they have. And today there's a struggle to end police violence, disproportional police violence against Black people, and we are seeing every day Yeah, so we're seeing people like get shot and murdered by the police, right. And this has to stop. So, so you start there, and then you say, and therefore we really need more representation and respect for our identity on campus, and we need more African studies. And those two things don't seem obviously connected, and I certainly don't see that. Let's say you're a middle to upper class black person going to Evergreen College, and you learn about your identity and then go off and become, a professor, that's going to change the fate of someone like Castile.
Okay, so
go ahead.
Okay, so yeah, it's not saying that's sufficient, but again, from both my readings, experience, so like for example, thinking about Native Americans, because Evergreen actually has a lot of programs and quite a few Native American faculty. That's one of the strengths here. And people learning about history, the religion, just culture. I think it really improves people's just feeling of equality and value. And it's not sufficient. And the same is true with African Americans. And to me, this history that's really been stolen from people a lot is something that's not just we're talking about 400 years ago, 350 years ago, but is still very, very relevant today in terms of, I guess identity. That's why I said before, I think identity is not destiny, but it's relevant. And in a white supremacist society where often that history is invalidated, seems to me really important to be part of the program, and maybe even more importantly, that it's commonly, a demand all over the country, going back to the 60s, but not stopping for more, not just African American studies, but African studies, indigenous studies too. That it's also, again, coming out of the not from me, but from people who. It seems like a pretty large, a part of what's being demanded. Again, it's not sufficient, but anyway, I would just add that.
Yeah, okay. Do you think Brett Weinstein would disagree with you about the importance of introducing more African studies at Evergreen?
I would hope not, but I really don't know.
Because to me, that seemed fairly uncontroversial. I mean,
but of course. But it does. I mean, but it's been. I've actually written up requests for this, and it hasn't. Again, we're under a lot of budget problems, but it has not been. It's never been funded. And again, I'm not blaming the administration here. I think it's more the faculty. If the faculty had made it more a priority, I think it would have probably happened. So it's not blaming the administration at all.
Is there a worry on the faculty if they introduce this new department, or that will mean cuts to their department and they'll lose their jobs?
Okay, no. So there's no departments here. Just, there's planning, it's like I'm in one called Sustainability and Justice. So it's not like there are no departments at Evergreen. It just, what seems to me, what happens, everybody says it's a good idea, again, talking like you said about Brett, but then other things always seem to be more priorities, deepening areas, and the argument, again, it's not fully valid. We can't fully invalid, we can't do everything. And it's true, I think you probably have to hire at least two people. And again, that gets into the issue of budget, because I think one would still be very token. So I'm really talking about two, even though the proposal I wrote didn't say two.
Yeah. Okay. So so let's put that aside now. And I think that's the kind of thing that seems reasonable to me to have two. The problem is, though, that not just Evergreen, but all universities are experiencing a budget crisis, it seems, I think. And I have to ask this. Do you think that some of the tension and pressure that's happening on campuses, that's being expressed as pressure around identity, is also just kind of an existential crisis, that higher education itself is in crisis and it's being expressed in this way?
Yeah, I mean, a much larger issue, I think the word's probably familiar to people who listen to your shows, neoliberalism, right? And certainly Washington's been a pretty bad state that way. I mean, all the West Coast, California, Oregon, Washington, with the whole kind of neoliberalism, more and more the idea of education, tuition paying for student enrollment. And to me, that's so different from the idea of education being a public good. Like, I've taken classes twice to Venezuela. Well, because I have a lot of hope for Venezuela. I'm not as much right now. In 2009 and 12, the whole quarter, and people would always ask me, is Evergreen a public or private school? And I'd always say public. And then they said, so tuition is free. And then I started to say what it was, and they said it's a private school if you're paying, $6,000-7,000 or more dollars a year. And first I thought it was my Spanish, but I realized the idea of a public university is the idea that the public, pays for it through taxes and so on. It's a right to everybody, and we don't have that. And there have really been the major cutbacks. When I first came here, the state paid the large majority of the costs of a year. Now it's the other way around. The tuition pays the majority of the costs.
So, I mean, would be an issue that would help, set up conditions where it might be easier to meet the needs of African American students if you had free education that was adequately funded.
Right.
Yeah. So, I mean,
so that's right. So I was going to add another question. It goes back, Doug, to a question you asked earlier. So, the question of students. So Evergreen, and we can talk about this later if you want. I probably have like 15 more minutes or so. So, yeah, the issue of enrollment's been a really major issue here. And there's been less applicants. So Evergreen is very close to open admissions. Any students who fill full requirements, they basically accept. And you have a situation now where a lot of students are really unprepared for doing college work, and it is very tied to both race and class. And so what I think would really be needed here, and some people suggest this, is having programs where students could learn. Maybe they wouldn't get college credit, and then after 6 months or a year, they would enter college. The problem with that is, I think legally, you can't give financial aid for people who are not in college credit-type programs. So the issue of, in terms of access, that to me would be a really good demand to add more issues of access. And I think they weren't strong enough in the demands we talked about earlier about access. I think is really, really, a major issue here. So I just wanted to add that to our discussion.
Yeah, you just opened up a huge can of worms. Yeah, but that's okay. So, I mean, that is important, right? I mean, and maybe I can have you back on just to talk about the crisis of education in general sometime. But the reason why that's important is because, it plays into the hands of right-wing racists. Because you say, yeah, we're accepting everybody now, and you're doing it for financial reasons, most of all, just to make sure you have the level of enrollment that you need to continue, right? So you have that, but then the students come and they're not prepared to actually participate on the level they need to, and that's not surprising, right? And it's not surprising because we've been under, just looking in the short term, we've had an economic crisis for the last almost a decade now. We're just coming out of it barely, and who knows if it'll hit again. So you have a population that's being squeezed in schools that are underfunded, just public schools, and are not often well run, coming from neighborhoods that are sometimes crime-ridden or not very stable, under-financed. And then they end up at a progressive college where demands are being made on them that they've never, that they are not prepared to meet. And so do they get angry? Of course. Of course they do, right? Yeah. So, yeah, it's a very deep problem.
I think added to that, so even before this current, the last month or so, Evergreen's had somewhat declining enrollment the last few years. It had gone close to 5,000. Now it's close to 4,000. And that is an unbelievable fear. In terms of administration, so much of what goes on is tied to enrollment. I'm not sure why the declining enrollment. It may be one factor that since the 2007 recession, even though I know jobs have gone up and wages really haven't, there's so much economic insecurity, even if employment has grown up a lot. my guess is maybe more students than 20 years ago was seeing college as really a way of making them marketable in the job market. And Evergreen really is like a liberal arts school. I mean, it has really good science programs, but business programs are very, very few, no engineering programs. The more job-oriented programs, the school doesn't have that. Plus, the whole interdisciplinary, the thing we talked about earlier called coordinated studies, it doesn't seem probably not appealing to many people. So we have had this thing of less enrollment. And the fear now, in terms of what's happened the last month, enrollment is unbelievably, the school's very afraid of. And to me, even though this isn't directly connected, I do think closing the school, and you may or may not know how Evergreen graduation was moved to Cheney Stadium last Friday. It cost $100,000 in a school that is not a wealthy school at all. To me, was really fitting into the fear. I understand the reasons. I think it was really overdone, and to me, is going to contribute, at least in the short run, to even more people afraid to come here, so the parents being afraid to come here. So the issue of enrollment, to me, is a really, really serious issue. And again, going back to Brett Weinstein, of course, it's not just him, but that, these are kind of right-wing threats to the school, I think, again, unconsciously on his part, but I think have that narrative contribute to the fear, which also is going to have, feedback in terms of enrollment.
Let me ask you this. Let's say that Brett Weinstein comes back to the university and come back to the college, and, there's protests. Is there any way that, because I can't imagine there wouldn't be more protests around him if he comes back. So, is there any way that a series of debates, which are, captured on video and digitally released, could be set up where, rather than accusations, rather than demands that microaggressions be managed, but that instead a real vigorous, hard-fought debate is set up around these issues so that at the end people walk away not with their understanding confirmed or their sense of indignation confirmed on either side, but where they walk away going, oh, now I understand the problem better? Is that possible? I mean, do you think that would help the school?
Okay, I think it would definitely help the school. I would support it. And whether it could happen or not, I'm not sure. I think on both sides, I think he'd be very hesitant. I think he has a lot of fear. I don't think he'll come back, but I'm not sure. I think there's some really reasons for the fear, but I do think it's over the top in terms of his fear. And I'm not sure the students, other people, a debate, discussion, like you say, the heated discussion, I do think would be necessary for any kind of healing to take place.
What if you got some celebrity leftists to come through and talk about it too, like someone like Cornel West or Adolph Reed or someone maybe not as well known as them, but Christopher Hedges or someone like that to come in to host and put together a debate. Would that help?
So I'll mention it to people. I think it's a pretty good idea. I mean, Cornel West comes here almost every year, and he's been here a lot. And is super popular with the students, as you can imagine, right? He's a very good speaker. And I think basically he has that moral aspect that is very appealing to a lot of younger people, too. It's not only strategic, but the moral strategic goes together. I do think that's a really, really good idea.